Well, let me tell you, this one is going to surprise you. It's about the evening when my daughter's boyfriend stayed just a little too long in the garage, and you truly won't believe how things turned out. Even now, when I think back, I still shake my head and wonder how such an ordinary night turned into something I'll never forget. But before I dive in, I want to know, where are you watching from tonight? I love hearing the cities, the little hometowns, the corners of the country people are tuning in from. It makes me feel like I'm not just telling my story into the dark, but sharing it with friends across the map. And if you're new here, well, don't be shy. Go ahead and subscribe, and tap that like button if you enjoy these kinds of stories. It means more than you think, knowing there are folks out there who want to sit down with me and listen. So, let me take you back to that night. I was 60, though people sometimes tell me I carry myself younger, probably because I keep busy. I live in a modest 2-story house on the edge of a small town, one of those neighborhoods where you know the sound of every dog barking and every car engine that rolls past. My daughter, Carrie, is 32 and has been living with me for a while. Life had handed her a few bumps, divorce, a career that didn't pan out the way she hoped, and so my home became her home again. Truthfully, I didn't mind. There's something comforting about the sound of another person's footsteps in the house when you've been alone for too long. Now, Carrie had been seeing this young man, Daniel, for close to 6 months. When I say young, I don't mean 20, no. He was 35, closer to her age than mine, but still, to me, it felt like he was just a kid. A tall, lanky fellow with dark hair that always seemed to fall into his eyes, and a voice soft enough that you had to lean in to catch every word. At first, I thought he was just another passing fancy. But then, he kept showing up, fixing things, staying for dinner, making sure Carrie's car was running smoothly. Slowly, he started to become more of a fixture than a guest. That evening had started like so many others. Carrie had gone out with some girlfriends, and Daniel had stopped by to help me with a small problem in the garage, the kind of problem I would have usually just lived with, but he insisted he could take care of. The old garage door had been sticking and groaning every time it rolled up, and while I'd grown used to the noise, Daniel said it wasn't safe. The garage itself is nothing special. A concrete floor with the faint oil stains of decades, wooden shelves stacked with paint cans that probably should have been thrown away years ago, the faint smell of dust and motor oil lingering in the air. That night it was lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, giving the whole place a dim, amber glow, the kind of light that softens edges and makes shadows dance across the walls. I stood there in the doorway as he worked, watching the way his hands moved with a quiet confidence. He wasn't loud or boastful about what he knew, just steady and sure, like he could coax the stubborn old door back into shape with a little patience. I remember thinking how rare that kind of patience was in men his age. Most rush through things, eager to prove themselves, but not him. It was while I was watching him that I noticed how still the house around us had become. Carrie wouldn't be home for hours, and outside, the neighborhood had already gone quiet. It was just the two of us, the hum of the bulb overhead, and the occasional creak of the wrench in his hand. Something about that silence pressed against me, not uncomfortable exactly, but noticeable. Like the air itself had shifted. "Almost got it," Daniel murmured, glancing back at me with a smile that caught me off guard. His teeth flashed in the dim light, his eyes crinkling at the corners. It wasn't the smile of a man trying to charm. It was smaller, warmer, as if we were sharing some little inside joke no one else could hear. I found myself smiling back, though I quickly busied my hands by brushing dust off an old shelf. At 60, you don't expect to feel flustered by a glance, especially not from someone younger, and certainly not from your daughter's boyfriend. And yet there it was, a little flutter I couldn't explain. We kept talking as he worked, small things at first. the weather. His job. My garden out back that I was so proud of, especially the roses that had finally bloomed in late summer. The conversation flowed more easily than I'd anticipated. His voice, though quiet, had a kind of warmth that wrapped around the room. Before I knew it, I'd pulled up a folding chair just to sit and listen while he tinkered with the bolts and hinges. It wasn't anything dramatic, no grand event or lightning strike, just a slow awareness that the longer we stayed out there, the more comfortable I felt in his presence. That comfort surprised me most of all. When you reach my age, people often stop looking at you as if you have stories worth hearing or feelings worth stirring. Yet here was this man, my daughter's boyfriend, no less, who looked at me as though what I had to say mattered. At one point, I laughed at something he said. I don't even remember what it was now. And he paused, really paused, to watch me laugh. The moment stretched, quiet but charged. I looked away quickly, but the memory of his gaze lingered. By the time he finally had the garage door moving smoothly again, more than 2 hours had passed. I hadn't realized how long we'd been out there until I glanced at the clock on the wall. The evening had settled into night, the crickets outside singing their steady song, and the air inside had grown cooler. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and turned toward me. "There," he said softly, almost like he was reluctant for the task to be over. "Good as new." I thanked him, probably more warmly than necessary, and for a moment we just stood there, neither of us rushing to leave. The quiet was back again, heavy but not unpleasant. It was the kind of quiet that made you aware of your own heartbeat, of the small space between two people. That night didn't end with any scandal or wild surprise, not yet. But it planted something, a seed, an awareness that would grow in ways I never anticipated. Looking back, I realized that was the beginning, the first time I noticed the subtle shift in how I saw him, and perhaps how he saw me. And if you think this is the end of the story, oh no. This was only the start of something much more complicated, more tender, and more unexpected than I could have ever imagined. After that night in the garage, I told myself it was nothing. Just a quiet evening, a little too much attention paid to small details, and a smile that lingered longer than it should have. I've lived long enough to know how the mind can trick you into seeing sparks where there are none. Still, as the days passed, I found myself remembering those moments with Daniel more often than I cared to admit. The sound of his voice, the way he focused on me as if no one else existed, it all stayed with me. Life went on as usual, of course. Carrie kept busy with her job and her outings, often leaving Daniel to stop by on his own. He'd show up with his sleeves rolled up, offering to help with this or that around the house. At first, I chalked it up to his kind nature, but after a while, I started to wonder if he simply liked being there. One Saturday afternoon, Carrie was away visiting friends out of town, and Daniel came over to check on the garage door again. He said he wanted to make sure it was still working smoothly, though I could see he had no real reason to be there. Still, I let him in, and we ended up in the kitchen instead of the garage. Now my kitchen isn't anything fancy. The cabinets are worn, the kind that have seen a lifetime of hands pulling them open and shut. The window above the sink lets in soft light in the afternoons, painting the room in warm gold. I was stirring a pot of soup when Daniel leaned against the counter, watching me with that same quiet attentiveness I'd noticed before. "You always cook from scratch?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough curiosity to make it sound sincere. "Most of the time," I replied, giving the soup another stir. "When you've been around as long as I have, you learn the joy of making something with your own hands. Besides, food just tastes better when it's cared for." He nodded thoughtfully, as though I'd just shared some great wisdom. That was another thing about him. He listened. Not the kind of listening where someone is only waiting for their turn to speak, but the kind where you can see in their eyes that your words are landing, being considered. It made me feel, well, seen, in a way I hadn't in years. We ate together at the little table by the window. The soup was nothing special, just a simple chicken and vegetable, but he complimented it like it was a feast. The more we talked, the more I forgot myself, forgot the years between us, forgot who he was to my daughter. For those moments, it was just two people sharing a meal, laughter spilling out at the small things. But somewhere deep inside, I knew there was more stirring beneath the surface. I could feel it in the way his eyes lingered on me just a second too long, in the way his hand brushed mine when he reached for the breadbasket. Each touch, each glance, carried a weight that neither of us spoke aloud. After dinner, we ended up back in the garage, though not for repairs this time. He noticed some old boxes stacked against the wall and asked if I needed help going through them. I laughed, saying I'd been putting it off for years, but before I knew it, we were sitting cross-legged on the concrete floor, dust rising around us as we opened box after box. Old photo albums, yellowed letters, trinkets from years gone by, they all came spilling out. I showed him a picture of me when I was young, no more than 20, standing beside a car that barely ran. My hair was long and loose, my smile carefree. Daniel studied the photo, then looked at me with a kind of wonder. "You haven't changed," he said quietly. I scoffed, waving him off. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. That was a lifetime ago." "No, really," he insisted, his gaze steady. "I can see it, the same spark in your eyes." His words sent a warmth through me that I hadn't felt in so long, a reminder that beneath the years and the gray hairs, I was still the same woman who once laughed without worry. I caught myself holding his gaze too long and quickly turned back to the box, but the feeling lingered. The hours slipped by again, unnoticed until the clock read close to midnight. I hadn't realized how much time we'd spent out there, talking, remembering, sharing pieces of ourselves that might have stayed hidden otherwise. As he prepared to leave, Daniel stood by the garage door, his hand resting on the frame. The night air drifted in, cool, and carrying the scent of damp earth. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It was as if the silence between us was full of words we weren't ready to say. "Thank you," I finally whispered, though I wasn't sure what exactly I was thanking him for, the repairs, the company, or the way he made me feel alive again. He nodded, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light. "Any time," he said softly, and then he was gone, leaving me standing in the doorway, heart unsteady, thoughts tangled. That night as I lay in bed, I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying every glance, every word, every small brush of his hand against mine. I told myself it was nothing, that I was reading too much into it, but deep down I knew better. Something was happening, something I couldn't quite name yet, but it was there, growing quietly between us. And so the story that began with a garage door and an unexpected evening was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning to unfold in ways that neither of us could have predicted. The days that followed were ordinary on the surface, but inside me, nothing felt ordinary anymore. It was as though a curtain had been lifted, and suddenly I saw things in sharper colors, in richer tones. Every time Daniel's car pulled into the driveway, I felt a little rush of anticipation, the kind I hadn't felt in decades. I told myself I was being foolish, that it was just the loneliness talking, but no matter how hard I tried, the truth kept pressing against me. Something had shifted, and there was no pretending otherwise. Carrie didn't notice, at least not then. She was wrapped up in her own world, her friends, her work, her plans. Daniel, meanwhile, seemed to drift naturally toward me whenever he came around. If Carrie was upstairs on the phone, he'd find himself in the kitchen with me. If she went out for the evening, he'd linger, asking if I needed anything done around the house. It was always casual, always innocent on the outside. But beneath it all, there was a current neither of us acknowledged aloud. One evening stands out sharper than the rest. It was late autumn, the kind of night where the air outside smelled of fallen leaves and wood smoke. Carrie had gone out again, leaving me alone with the quiet hum of the house. I was sitting in the living room, knitting, something I often do when the evenings stretch long, when I heard a knock at the door. It was Daniel. He stood there with that same boyish smile, holding a small bag in his hand. "I brought you something," he said, a little sheepishly. Inside the bag was a loaf of bread from a bakery in town. He explained that he'd driven past it earlier and thought of me, remembering how much I'd said I loved fresh bread with soup. Such a small gesture, but it nearly undid me. At my age, people don't often bring you little gifts just because they were thinking of you. That kind of attention is rare, and it touches deeper than most realize. I invited him in, and before long we were in the kitchen again, slicing the bread, heating a pot of leftover stew. The room filled with the smell of rosemary and warm crust, and we sat together at the table like it was the most natural thing in the world. Our conversation wandered, as it always did, from small talk to deeper things. He told me about his childhood, the struggles of growing up with a father who was rarely home. I listened, my heart aching for the boy he once was. In turn, I shared pieces of my own past, stories I hadn't told in years. The joys, the regrets, the quiet moments that had shaped me. It was during one of those silences that I realized how close we were sitting. His arm brushed mine, just barely, and neither of us moved away. My breath caught, and for a heartbeat, I thought he might reach for my hand. But he didn't. Instead, he just sat there, his presence enough to fill the room with something unspoken. Later, we drifted into the garage again, as if it had become our place. There was nothing to fix this time. We simply sat on the old wooden bench near the work table, the single bulb overhead casting its amber light. The night outside was quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves. I don't know how long we sat there, talking about everything and nothing. The air between us grew heavier, but not in a way that frightened me. If anything, it felt grounding, like we were sharing something fragile but real. At one point, I noticed him watching me again, that same lingering gaze I'd seen before. "What is it?" I asked softly, trying to steady my voice. He hesitated, then shook his head with a small smile. "You remind me of strength," he said. "The kind of strength that doesn't shout, but just endures. I admire that." The words struck me deeper than I expected. At 60, you don't often hear such things, and when you do, they tend to sound hollow, obligatory. But coming from him, it was different. There was no flattery in his tone, no agenda, just truth. I felt my throat tighten, and I had to look away, blinking back a rush of unexpected emotion. We didn't cross any lines that night, not in the way people might assume. But in some ways, what passed between us was even more intimate. It was a closeness of spirit, a recognition that went beyond age or circumstance. I could feel it growing, even though I knew how complicated it was becoming. When he finally left, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. I lay awake for hours, listening to the tick of the clock in the hall, my mind turning over every word, every glance. I told myself again that it was nothing, that I was imagining feelings that didn't belong. But the ache in my chest told a different story. In the days that followed, I began to notice how careful he was around me, almost as if he knew the line we were both tiptoeing near. And yet there were still those moments, the lingering looks, the shared laughter, the quiet silences that spoke louder than words. By then, I knew there was no denying it. Something real was happening between us, something unexpected and powerful. It wasn't a matter of if it would change everything, but when. And though I couldn't yet see where it was leading, I knew the path ahead was no longer the same as the one behind. The winter came in quietly that year. One day the leaves were still scattered across the yard, and the next, the world seemed wrapped in gray skies and bare branches. The air grew sharper, the nights longer, and with them, my thoughts heavier. By then, I could no longer pretend that what was happening with Daniel was just in my head. The bond between us had deepened in ways I hadn't expected, and though no lines had been crossed in the obvious sense, the truth was undeniable. We were drawn to each other, not with wild passion or recklessness, but with something quieter, something rooted in understanding and respect. The hardest part was Carrie. She remained blissfully unaware, and every time I watched her laugh with him or brush his arm as they passed, a twinge of guilt pierced me. This was her relationship, her choice, her world, and yet there I was, carrying something that felt like a secret. One evening, just a week before Christmas, everything came to a head. The house was lit with soft yellow lights, and I decorated it with garlands and candles, determined to hold on to the traditions that gave the season its comfort. Carrie had gone shopping with a friend, leaving me alone in the kitchen, finishing up a batch of sugar cookies. The sweet smell filled the air, and Christmas music hummed softly from the radio. Then came the knock at the door. It was Daniel again, holding a small box wrapped in plain brown paper. "For you," he said simply, handing it over. I frowned, setting the box on the counter. "Daniel, you didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted gently. His eyes held mine, steady and unflinching. "Go on, open it." Inside was a book, an old, worn copy of a novel I'd once mentioned in passing, a favorite from my youth that had long been lost to time. The cover was frayed, the pages yellowed, but it was perfect. My hands trembled as I held it, and for a moment I couldn't speak. "You remembered," I finally whispered. "Of course I did," he said softly. Something shifted in that moment, something neither of us could push aside any longer. I felt tears prick at my eyes, not of sadness, but of being truly seen, truly remembered. At 60, gifts are often practical, polite. But this was different. This was someone saying, "I know you. I see you." We stood there in the glow of the kitchen lights, the snow just beginning to fall outside. The silence stretched, thick with everything unspoken. Then, without thinking, I reached out and touched his hand, just lightly, just enough to feel the warmth of his skin against mine. His fingers curled around mine in response, tentative but sure. Our eyes met, and in that instant, I understood the depth of what had grown between us. Not an affair, not a betrayal, but a connection that had slipped into our lives when we weren't looking. I pulled back first, my heart pounding. "Daniel," I said, my voice trembling, This can't go on." He nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of sadness and understanding. "I know." And yet there was no anger in his voice, no frustration, only respect. He released my hand, and for a long while, we just stood there, two people caught in the gravity of something larger than themselves. When Carrie returned later, she found us sitting at the table, the cookies cooling on the counter, the book resting between us. To her, it must have looked like nothing more than a quiet evening spent in companionship. She didn't know the storm that had passed in silence just moments before. In the weeks that followed, Daniel began to visit less often. Not abruptly, not cruelly, but gradually, as if he was giving us both the space we needed. He and Carrie eventually drifted apart, as young couples often do. She took it in stride, shrugging it off as one of those things that simply wasn't meant to last. But for me, the memory of that winter lingered, not in the way of regret, but as a reminder. A reminder that even at 60, the heart is capable of stirring, of being seen, of finding connection in the most unexpected places. Sometimes, late at night, I still pull out that old book and run my fingers along its frayed edges. It reminds me not of temptation, but of recognition. Of a moment in time when I was reminded that I was more than just a mother, more than just a woman growing older. I was still someone worth knowing, worth remembering. And though Daniel and I never crossed that final line, what we shared was real. It was tender. It was human. And in its own quiet way, it changed me. So when people ask about that winter, about the time my daughter's boyfriend stayed too long in the garage, I just smile. They'll never really know the whole of it, the way it unfolded slowly, softly, like snow settling on bare branches. But I'll always carry it with me, not as a scandal, not as a burden, but as a story of unexpected connection, and the reminder that the heart never truly grows old.